Hi, welcome back to another episode of Nobody's Doing It Right, the podcast for those who are uncertain. My name is Kat. I am your host. For today's episode, we're going to talk about how every time you don't do what you say you're going to do, you're sacrificing the person you want to be. Now, of course, obviously, I want to preface that there are many things in life that we cannot control, and even if we want to show up a certain way, our circumstances don't allow it. And that's totally valid and totally fine. This isn't to say that you have control over everything in your life and that all of it is because you are just not doing that thing. There are many things that we can't control. I'm just talking about the things that we can control and that we sometimes don't. We don't take that control when we do have the opportunity for it. And I just want to let anyone else know who is struggling with this, because this is what I have to tell myself and what has resonated with me when it comes to doing the things that I know I want to do in order to become or see myself as a specific version of myself. If you don't do that thing, every time you don't do that thing, every time you avoid it, every time you say, no, I don't want to right now, or it's too much work, or, whatever narratives pop up, every time that happens, you are sacrificing that person. You're sacrificing that person who is calling to you to step into it, right? To step into that energy, into that version. And that's really sad because I think we are in relationship with our future self, whatever that future self will look like. Just like we're in relationship with our past self. I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that your past self, your inner child, your child self is still with you and is still at times dictating how you show up. And you might not even realize it. So it's important to have a good relationship with that past version of yourself. And I know that sounds a little bit convoluted and confusing. Like, how do you have a relationship with your past self? But I think doing inner child work, as I've had to do with my therapist, has been really beneficial in that. Looking back and asking myself, okay, let me have a conversation with my inner child, thinking about what age, the thought of my inner child is. For me, it's age 11 for some reason. For you, it might be something else. And then having a conversation with that child self and seeing what needs they have, why they keep, popping up in your mind, why that age specifically. Having a good relationship with them and recognizing in what ways you may not have shown up for them in the way that they needed you to in your life. And processing that grief, processing that sadness. But that also applies to your future self too. And when you don't show up in the ways that you want to show up in order to be this specific version, you are sacrificing them. You are doing them, your future version, a disservice. And that's really sad too. And I know it seems almost illogical to look at it that way, or it seems like not that big of a deal because, that person doesn't even exist yet. But it's like they could, and there is something in you that's telling you that you want to be that person. So they are calling to you in a way. And every time you don't show up for them, they feel it. I know it sounds very woo-woo. I'm not trying to make it too complicated. I'm just trying to look at it from a perspective of like the present moment where you are right now and how you aren't even showing up for yourself right now, let alone that future version of yourself that you want to step into but aren't. And you're sacrificing that by also sacrificing your current self. Because, also whenever you don't do that thing you say you're going to do today, making sure that, of course, that it is within your capabilities right now and your circumstances. When you don't do that thing, you're telling yourself presently that you are not worthy of it, that you don't even believe you're worthy of it, you're not good enough for it, that you can't do it. It creates very negative narratives in your mind when you don't show yourself that you are doing it, that you're taking action or you're taking control when you can, in the same way that your inner child would have needed an adult version of you to do that for them. So you see how it's all interconnected? And then your future self that's waiting for you to step into that version is losing hope in a sense, right? Because you might never become that version of yourself that you really want to be, that you feel called to, because you're not taking the action. And I understand, of course, there is a lot of fear at times to do that. There's a lot of, self-shaming that comes along with doing these actions that take you to that version of yourself. There's a lot of resistance because of any self-limiting beliefs you have that you've been conditioned to believe about yourself. I understand all of those things. So I'm not here to guilt you or shame you. I'm just trying to put this perspective at the forefront of your mind every time you notice yourself saying, I'm not going to do that thing, or no, I'll do it tomorrow, or whatever. You don't have to do it perfectly. It does not have to be perfect. It just has to be done most of the time. Just to even show yourself that you believe you are worthy of becoming that version of yourself. And of course, that version of yourself, that future version that you're envisioning now, when you get to them, it might not look at all like what you're envisioning right now, because Life unfolds differently than what we expect. We can't preemptively plan all of those things. But to even step into it in some small way, you're telling your present self that you believe you're worthy of it, and you're telling your future self, whatever they look like for you, that you're taking action towards them. You're honoring them in some way. And this can be really tricky, again, because the resistance that comes along with the idea of becoming that version of ourselves, whatever fears are underlying it, whatever you're scared of happening, whatever you're scared of experiencing, whether that means even alienating people in your life right now to become that version of yourself, you have to decide which you're more willing to sacrifice, because everything has a sacrifice, unfortunately. In life, there's a sacrifice to everything. You cannot avoid the sacrifice, and you cannot avoid the grief that comes along with these sacrifices. It's unavoidable. So you have to decide every step of the way what you're willing to sacrifice right now. What's more worth it right now? That might mean sometimes, okay, considering my circumstances, I can't do this thing that steps into that version of myself. Okay. You're realizing, you're consciously deciding, I have to sacrifice this right now because of maybe external circumstances that you can't control. That's fair. That's valid. It's good to be aware and conscious of that decision. But in other moments, you might need to sacrifice the things that are not aligned with that version of yourself, even if that means sacrificing what you've known for so long up until now. That might mean relationships with people. That might just mean the way people perceive you. You might have to sacrifice this old version of yourself in their heads that they can't hold on to anymore because that's not how you're showing up. You have to decide if that's more worth it for you. And that'll keep coming up. Those questions will keep coming up. Those moments, those forks in the road will keep coming up. And it's important to be mindful of the sacrifice throughout the process and deciding, am I sacrificing that future version that I want to get to, or am I sacrificing the version of myself that is no longer aligned for me? Which am I more willing to sacrifice right now? And again, it's not necessarily right or wrong, good or bad. It's not this intrinsically moral thing. It's about what's right or wrong for you, what you want to experience in your life. I obviously can't tell you that you're doing it wrong or you're doing it right or whatever. It's about what's right or wrong for you. But I just want to bring this concept of sacrificing your future self into your awareness if you haven't thought of it that way before. Because when I started realizing this for myself, it changed the way I showed up. And I realized the relationship I have with my future self is just as important as the one I have with my present self and my past self. And I've done a lot of past self work that's been really vital in my own personal growth and the way I now show up and do things and think about myself, treat myself. So you cannot neglect the future self as well. You have a relationship with them. You get to decide what that relationship looks like. And I think it's really important to be mindful of that and recognize that every time you don't do that thing you say you're going to do, your future self is listening, because it's still you, right? It's just you in the future, but your present self has access to that. They're listening and they recognize it, and you might never get to them. And it would be really sad to not embody that specific storyline if that's something that you're being called to and the only thing standing in your way is you. That's really sad, both for you and for that future version who can't be recognized for what they are or how you want to experience life. And when I started thinking of it this way, it changed the way I showed up, because every time I was faced with something that I know I needed to do, or wanted to do rather, and I had the choice of either doing it or not doing it, now the thought of my future self, this version that I want to be, the version of myself that's also intertwined with my younger self too, I have that image of her, and I have to actively decide whether or not I'm going to sacrifice her in this moment. And if I do sacrifice her for this specific decision, is the decision I'm sacrificing her for worth it? Or is it just a decision that's based in comfort, based in fear, based in all these things that are not worth it to me in many ways? They're just is based in ease, based in maybe even laziness at times. I can acknowledge that about myself. I now have to be faced with that, and it's so much harder to sacrifice your future self or any version of yourself when you have to be faced with that decision and think about them every time an action or a decision is brought up that you have to face, that fork in the road. It's so much harder to say no, to sacrifice it when you're faced with that person, and you can envision them and you can see them and you can see yourself saying no to them, neglecting them, abandoning them in the same way that you might have abandoned your younger self or your inner child every time you now don't stand up for yourself with people who you need to stand up for in order to protect that inner child, So it is kind of, again, intertwined. All your versions are interconnected in that way. And yeah, I just wanted to bring this to your awareness if you haven't thought about it this way. Because again, when I think about it this way, it changes the way I show up. Now, again, I sometimes do sacrifice that person because of other circumstances. But the circumstance has to be more worth it than the sacrifice, because you're going to have to live with those consequences. You are going to have to live with those, nobody else. And how sad and unkind to yourself to force yourself to live with those consequences when you don't have to, when it's not a decision based out of necessity because of your circumstances, but based out of fear, resistance, ease, or wanting comfort, or laziness, or whatever. That's such a shame. It's such a disservice for you now and for your future self. So I hope this was helpful. I hope it was informative. I hope it gave you a different perspective. If you want to talk about this in more detail, feel free to book a one-to-one call with me. You can also read my essays on topics like this over on my Substack. And it's also a great way to just support my content as well if you become a subscriber on there. And you can also follow my social media for all my other content as well. Other than that, I'll be back again soon with another episode.